Hi, everyone. I want to talk about childhood trauma and adult children of narcissists, and even include adult children of alcoholic families, because often the trauma is very similar. When I think about childhood trauma, particularly for ACONs and ACOAs, and now we're adults, what do we need to kind of start with to begin? And what I think about the healing process begins with caring for the little wounded child within us, because that child has been wounded and they've experienced some real difficult times. Not only do we experience an incident that has been traumatic, we might also experience smaller traumas that are chronic and that occur over and over and over again, such as shaming, discarding, ignoring. And then there can be more traumas that we might experience that could include physical abuse and other types of abuse from a narcissistic parent who believes they're right and that they really don't have the empathy they need to be parents. And I think that's one of the difficulties with narcissistic parents, is in lacking that empathy. So I think about caring for that little wounded child inside. I also think about choosing to be for, you're going to be for that little wounded child, and making that decision that I'm going to take care of me internally. I'm going to begin to care about my insides and what's going on in there. We want to begin to heal by, again, in general terms, making the world that we're in the opposite of the world that we had growing up. Safer, calmer, that's very important. Adding nurturing and self-compassion to ourselves, being attentive to ourselves and becoming more self-aware, and being less enmeshed with the toxic parent, or actually becoming less enmeshed with the trauma. What I found is that folks who have experienced trauma, then not only do they have a trauma bond with the person who has traumatized them, but then we become enmeshed with the trauma itself. And that would make sense given our emotional process that we have inside. Trauma bonding, when we've grown up in a traumatic situation where a parent was always critical, hypercritical, rejecting, shaming, abandoning, those kinds of things that would happen in an alcoholic home, in a narcissistic parent home, that we end up with a trauma bond in which physically we feel connected to this trauma, and many times connected with the person who's perpetrating the trauma. And another way of thinking about trauma bond, maybe you have read Patrick Carnes, who's kind of the first one who began talking about trauma bonding. It could also be called a danger bond. And so what we find ourselves is living in a danger bond type of life, which is very painful, difficult, full of anxiety and fear and hypervigilance, and also a re-traumatizing of ourselves. We then internalize the trauma that has occurred to us, and then emotionally we integrate that and turn it on ourselves. And that becomes very painful and very difficult, as many of you could probably attest. Now, we can't change what happened in the past, but I believe it's possible to change how we traumatize ourselves. That's something we have some control over and can begin to heal in that way. I know that there are many trauma type of feelings: anxiety, helplessness, having flashbacks of things that have occurred in the past, trauma repetition review. We're always going over that trauma and reviewing it inside, to the point we even can forget where we are in time and space. And I think that's one of the important things in healing from trauma, is that when we start to re-experience that trauma or have that emotional overloading or flooding, then we want to work on where are we at in time and space right now. We're not back there, we're here and we're now. And I can begin to make my world safer for me. Also, another feeling is hypervigilance. We're always scanning, looking, waiting for more trauma. And in fact, we'll even see trauma where trauma doesn't exist. That can occur very commonly also. What are the effects of childhood trauma? We can have flashbacks. We also can have withdrawal and cravings for the toxic person or family member or parent. What I found is, let's say we have a mother, a caregiver who was narcissistic and traumatizing. We have a craving for that person. And that craving involves hoping they will change, hoping they will not treat me that way the next time, and that maybe we can make this right if I continue to focus on them. And so often we end up with a trauma perpetrator focus rather than a self focus. And that self focus is very important. After decades of narcissistic abuse from parents, how is healing possible? What is required in the stage of chronic PTSD that's occurred over time, and emotional and psychological exhaustion, chronic unemployment, and loneliness? That's not so unusual for many people who've grown up in those types of families. Now, this question is a complicated one because there's many layers in there. You have the CPTSD. What do I do about that? Learning about CPTSD, there's a great workbook on CPTSD. I think it's called the CPTSD workbook. That's a great resource to begin to work on that part of our healing. Then there's emotional and psychological exhaustion, and that can occur also. Now, does it come out in the form of depression? Does it come out in the form of something that we need maybe medical help for as well? Because we have just been so depleted, and that depression is just comes out of our past trauma. We may need some help with that. And I found folks who get some medical help for their exhaustion, their depression, then they can even work more on getting out of that hole. We may need a little boost if we have that difficulty. Not everybody does, but some people do need that extra boost. Then when you talk about chronic unemployment and loneliness, that's not uncommon either. We do need that kind of talk coaching or talk therapy to help us begin to pull out of those dysfunctional patterns of not being able to be employed and feeling very lonely and isolated. We have been trained to feel lonely and isolated. The beginnings of that, the embryonic start of that healing is, okay, I've got this loneliness going on. The loneliness gets perpetrated and ongoing because I'm now lonely and detached from my own inner self and my own little child or the little Jerry. I'm not connected with him, so I'm going to feel really lonely and really isolated. I remember in my experience of being in a crowd, I remember pastoring when I was pastoring in a church, and that I could have all the friends in the world, I could have all the people around me, but I was not connected to me, so I still felt lonely in a crowd. Even though everybody was there, was nice to me, wanted to be friends, but I couldn't do that because I was not connected to me and didn't know even how to take care of me. And so that learning is very important. Connecting to that inner self. And I like Margaret Paul's work on inner bonding. And that's a beginning where we begin to bond with ourselves rather than bonding with the trauma and bonding with the trauma perpetrator. Now I'm going to bond with me. And so I think that's what's very important that we do. Another question, how do we stop internalizing things? And I think that's a very good question. Often, when we've been grown up in a narcissistic home or grown up in an alcoholic home, what is most common is we absorb everything, we internalize everything. And so, as adults, we can begin to stop internalizing, but we still have what's been internalized. And so, we want to begin to put words to it, identify feelings, becoming more aware of where we are in time and space. And I think this helps with healing and externalizing the internalized mess that we have been given growing up. And so I think talking to others, 12-step groups, places where you can begin to talk and put words to the pain, put words to the feelings, even beginning to journal and things such as that can help begin to take this internalized storm and begin to put it on paper, begin to put it into words so that we can begin to heal. And I'm talking about the beginning phases of that type of healing. For a lot of folks that I work with who are adult children of narcissistic parents, I want to be a reparenter of sorts, and I want to help them reparent themselves. And that may mean going back to the trauma, which they're already rehearsing over and over, that trauma repetition review that's going over and over and over in their head. And okay, let's take that review and start to talk about it. What's going on with you? What are you feeling? What are you thinking? What are you believing about yourself? And oftentimes, ACOAs and ACONs don't have much of a strong belief about themselves. It's a very, very slight belief in themselves. As we become adults, maybe that changes just a little bit because we're adults. We're not living as children who are powerless and vulnerable and being subjected to the narcissistic parent or the scapegoating or those kinds of things that happen in those families. And that as adults, we have a little more breathing room, and that we want to build on that breathing room and go, wait a minute, we're not in the middle of that right now, and we don't have to be in the middle of that. I had a client that I'd worked with. I'll change the details so there's no confidentiality broken. Let's say she has a sister who's a narcissist, major narcissist. And she was often communicating with that sister because she thought she should. The sister would contact her daily, if not more. And she would go through this pain, that poor and unhealthy relationship, time and time again throughout the day. And then the next day it would all start again. And her sister would be negative, criticizing, and she'd say, Jerry, how can I be more detached from my sister? And how can I be in such a way that I'm not as upset by her? Well, the first thing I began to point out, which again, the ACON may not notice. They don't notice these types of things. For example, we disbelieve the obvious and we accept the impossible. That's what ACONs and adult children of alcoholics tend to do. We disbelieve the obvious and we accept the impossible. So she was always trying to wait on and have a better relationship with her sister. But her sister didn't have any interest in having a better relationship. She just wanted to have her relationship, whatever she wanted. And that one of the things that I mentioned is, so have you ever thought about talking to your sister less often? And it never even occurred to her to do that. It's not because she was stupid. She was very well educated, very observant about many things. But when it came to her own internalization, her own family dynamics and dysfunction that was in her, she didn't know, I hadn't even thought about not talking to her less. Or if I talk to her less, my sister will be upset. Well, so the trade-off is that you're going to be upset, not your sister. And that somehow is worthwhile, then I need to be the one upset, not my sister. Because if I decided I want to talk to her once a day, my sister wouldn't like that at all. It's like, okay, she might not like that, but you're miserable in talking to her every day, being texted many times throughout the day, and that we want to reduce that frequency so you don't continue to keep being pinged and triggered by this uncaring, mean, critical sister. So that was a new thought to her. And again, believing in the impossible, that maybe if I treat her a different way, or if I'm able to just be less upset by her, that will be easier. Well, it would be easier if you would be less upset by her, but you're still being overly stimulated by that relationship. And I find that true with narcissistic parents too. They will be intrusive and expect a lot in terms of how they want to relate to you. And it just becomes a real problem. And they don't think about how they could possibly reduce that interaction and that pinging and that triggering for themselves. And so we began to work on, well, let's slow that down and let's deal with your guilt. And remember, you can live without your sister. You can't live without your peace. You can live without your narcissistic parent, but you can't live without your inner peace. That will be very, very damaging and troubling for your life. And so we begin to talk about that, and they can begin to make more mature choices in that regard. Probably most of you are aware that trauma, as you read in the other trauma books that are out there, Van der Kolk and Peter Levine and different folks will talk about how trauma lives inside the body. It lives inside of us, in the cells, and that it still continues even if a parent dies. That trauma may continue on within us. And so it will be important for us to become more aware of our body and what's going on inside our body. Many times I will ask someone I'm working with to tell me, what are you feeling and where are you feeling it? And let's give that part of you a voice. Let that part of you talk. If it could talk, what would it say? I feel it in my chest. I feel it in my stomach. I feel it in my neck. I feel it in my back. I feel it in my heart here. I feel it in my gut way low. Then let's give that a voice so that it can begin to talk. And I think if we are able to put words to our physical sensations, because there's feelings and emotions and there's physical sensations, and we want to be aware of both and become more aware of those. And I think giving them a voice is a very important part of healing when it comes to trauma. Probably virtually every child experienced some trauma sometime, whatever family they're in. That's not uncommon. And again, a one-time trauma is still problematic, but if you live in a home in which you have a parent who is continually toxic, whether neglectful or abusive or critical, mean, rejecting. And I've heard some pretty strong stories from folks who have been definitely rejected by their parents. Then not only do we live that trauma, but then that trauma starts to live in us. That's when CPTSD begins. That's when we begin to have that trauma bonding, when that trauma lives within us. So when you go and get help, you want to begin to work on getting the trauma out of you by acknowledging, expressing, healing, self-bonding, learning self-belief or belief in self. Often those things are missed and are not included in a childhood growing up with those kinds of difficulties. I hope you will join the channel. I hope you'll make comments. I hope you'll subscribe. And that what I want to do is to try to help my followers and my viewers overcome those dysfunctional dynamics. One of the things that I think about in the whole area of trauma and trauma recovery is we want to begin to resist being emotionally unavailable to ourselves. And that's learning how to identify feelings, using a feelings list. Begin to sit down in the morning and go, how do I feel right now? It's okay that I feel that. I've been through a lot growing up. It's okay that I feel that. It's okay that I write about it. It's okay that I express it. And that we want to learn to become more emotionally available to ourselves. And in that way, can we begin to heal? We can begin to reparent ourselves. Because if I know how I feel, let's say I'm feeling anxious, sad, I feel hurt, or I feel rejection. Those are all common feelings for someone who's had childhood trauma. Now, what does that little child who is feeling those things need from the big you, from the adult you? What does that child need? And are you ready or able to give that to that little child? Because that pain that they're expressing, it is an alert for needing compassion, love, acceptance, and that what do I need right now? If I'm feeling hurt, if I'm feeling abandoned, if I'm feeling shame, what do I need? And we can't wait on the narcissistic parent to give it. They couldn't give it and can't give it now. But I can begin to give it to me. What do I need? Do I need a hug? Do I need some love? Can I give myself some compassion and caring and acceptance? It's okay that you feel this way because look what's going on. I also hope that if you like this video, you'll click like, because those likes are important for the message to get out, for others to see these videos. And I've offered a number of videos at no charge, quite a few, 300, 370, a lot of videos I've tried to give away because people have given to me over the years. I want to give back. There are people who may not be able to afford counseling or coaching. Well, you have a lot of videos you can take a look at and learn and grow from those videos.